The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. Everyone thought they already knew how the case would end. A former inmate, a police officer's testimony, and a long record that seemed impossible to escape. But what no one in that room expected was that before the day was over, a single voice would shake every assumption, expose a lie, and force an entire courtroom to question what they believed about truth and power. She sat calmly at the defense table, her hands folded, her expression steady. Years earlier, her life had been defined by one mistake, a mistake she had already paid for. Since her release, she had worked quietly, rebuilding piece by piece, trying to prove to herself more than anyone else that people could change. But when an officer stopped her one evening and accused her of a crime she insisted she did not commit, the past came rushing back like a shadow she could not outrun. The officer's testimony sounded confident, detailed, and persuasive. He spoke in a firm voice, describing events in a way that made it seem simple, almost obvious. The prosecutor leaned on every word, repeating key phrases, letting the story settle into the minds of the jurors. To many in the room, it seemed like the case was already decided, but her attorney watched closely, taking notes, listening not just to what was said, but to what was missing. Small details did not line up. Times were slightly off. The sequence of events seemed too neat, too polished. The attorney leaned toward her and whispered something. She nodded, her eyes focused, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. When it was finally time for the defense to speak, the room shifted. People leaned forward. Even the judge's expression changed slightly. Sensing that something unexpected was about to unfold, her attorney stood and began quietly, almost casually, asking the officer to repeat parts of his story. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but then the questions became more precise. Where exactly had he been standing? What time had he called it in? Which camera had recorded the scene? The officer hesitated. Just for a second. But in a courtroom, a second can feel like an eternity, and that was when everything began to change. The defense attorney requested permission to present evidence that had not been discussed earlier in the trial. The judge allowed it, and a screen was brought into the courtroom. People exchanged glances, curiosity spreading like a ripple through the gallery. The footage that appeared was not dramatic at first. It showed a quiet street, dimly lit, with only occasional cars passing. The timestamp in the corner was clear. The attorney asked the officer to confirm the time he claimed the incident occurred. The officer repeated his statement, his voice steady but less confident than before. Then the attorney advanced the video by a few minutes. The same street appeared, unchanged, empty. No sign of the confrontation the officer had described. A murmur began in the courtroom, soft but unmistakable. The attorney paused the video and turned to the officer. Calmly, carefully, she asked him to explain the discrepancy. The officer shifted in his seat. He said the camera must have been malfunctioning, or perhaps the angle had missed something. The explanation sounded thin, even to those who wanted to believe him. Then the defense revealed another recording, this one from a different camera further down the street. This angle showed the officer's patrol car arriving much later than he had testified. The timeline no longer fit. The story that had sounded so certain now seemed full of cracks. The prosecutor objected, but the judge overruled, allowing the defense to continue. The jurors watched intently, their earlier confidence fading, replaced by doubt. Finally, the attorney asked a single question that seemed to hang in the air. Was it possible that the officer had mistaken the time? The officer hesitated again, and in that hesitation, the weight of the moment became clear to everyone watching. For the first time since the trial began, it no longer felt like a simple case. It felt like the truth was still fighting to be heard. When she was called to speak, the courtroom grew quiet once more. She stood slowly, not with anger, but with a calm strength that drew everyone's attention. She spoke about the years she had spent rebuilding her life, about the job she had worked hard to keep, about the promise she had made to her family that she would never return to the life she once knew. Her voice did not rise, but it carried. She explained where she had been that night, how she had walked home, how she had been stopped without explanation. She spoke about the fear of being judged not for who she was, but for who she had been. Then she said something that seemed to settle over the room like a quiet truth. She said that justice is not only about punishing the guilty, but about protecting the innocent, even when the innocent are imperfect people. The jurors listened closely, some leaning forward, others taking notes. The officer stared at the table in front of him, no longer meeting anyone's eyes. In closing arguments, the defense did not attack or accuse. Instead, the attorney reminded the jury that the foundation of justice is certainty, and that certainty cannot exist where there is doubt, where timelines do not match, and where evidence tells a different story than testimony. Hours later, when the verdict was read, the silence returned, deeper than before. But this time, it was not the silence of assumption. It was the silence of realization. As she walked out of the courtroom, the sunlight outside felt brighter than it had in years. The world had not changed overnight, and the road ahead would not be easy. But in that moment, she knew something important. Truth, when patiently and courageously revealed, has a way of being heard, even in the loudest and most crowded rooms.